Fantastic to see you here. So good to see you. We're diving into solutions to emotional eating, and it gives rise often to the question like, well, don't I, why am I an adult and I don't really have the skills to feel my feelings? Why have I ended up being somebody who turns to food instead of feeling your feelings? Now, the way I work as a coach is not really psychotherapeutic, but sometimes it does help a little bit just to look back to our family of origin and see a few connections in our upbringing, why it makes perfect sense that I would have developed an overeating behavior. And the reason that it helps to do this is so that we have compassion for the overeating behavior, for ourselves, for having adopted what's an essentially a sort of adaptive survival strategy. If feeling our feelings isn't an option, then we must take them away somehow with food. And so, when we first learnt to overeat, it might have been our best bet at the time. We can just be so kind to ourselves for that, right? It's a simple and smart solution that didn't hurt anyone at the time. Now, many years down the line, we might be driven mad by the habit. We might feel obsessed, out of control, upset. We might feel like our headspace is dominated by it. We might struggle with our weight or maybe our health as a result of the choices that we make around food that feel like they aren't really in our control. And that's okay. Like, what has happened is just that something that helped when we were 7 or 12 or 20 is now not helping, is now tripping us up. So why don't we have emotional skills? I mean, this is a fascinating question because I've had to ask it of myself a lot, right? I think of myself as having had an upbringing that was quite liberal, with a mum who is quite psychologically literate in many ways. So why don't we have emotional skills? Why don't I end up using food emotionally? That's funny. Why am I so emotionally avoidant? Well, one reason is our upbringing. So there's a couple of books that I can recommend on parental emotional neglect. I think neglect is quite a heavy piece of terminology, and that actually there's a lot of reasons why our parents might have been preoccupied and they sort of overlook our emotions in the process. So, for example, my parents were young, they were in their 20s, and they moved into a really derelict house. So you can imagine that they were quite in survival mode, just trying to put a new roof on it, trying to put glass in the windows, trying to get it to a point where it wasn't cold in winter. And at the same time, my mum had little kids, so she was washing our clothes in a tea urn and trying to find the money for food. You can sort of see how the daily survival of life was completely preoccupying, right? And how her emotional world was also probably pretty uppermost in her mind because her needs weren't met enough for her to then necessarily make a lot of space for ours. And there's no reproach there, right? But there's lots of reasons why our parents might be preoccupied. That I can see myself as a parent often being preoccupied. Can you see this board? By the way, perhaps I can bring it a little closer for you so that you can read it. Parents might be preoccupied because they're not interested, because they're addicts, because they're depressed, because they focus on your siblings, or your siblings have particular needs that require them to pay special attention to them. Maybe you had a parent who was a narcissist, or who had money worries, or maybe your parents were in conflict and they took up each other's energy that way. And you were emotionally overlooked because they were busy with their emotions. Maybe one of your parents had lost one of their loved ones and was consumed by grief. It's quite hard for us to make space for other people's emotions when our own emotional world is very salient. Maybe they were obsessed by work. Workaholic parents don't have a great deal of time for their children's emotional world. Or maybe, on the other hand, your upbringing was very authoritarian. My dad, for example, was sent to boarding school, prep school, age 6. So that, was quite a strict institution that didn't prioritize those boys' emotional life. They had to suck it up and get on with it, right? So maybe if you were raised in a school or an institution, emotions weren't at the forefront of that. Maybe your parents were I put socialites, but like really socially conscious, really worried about what everyone else thought. And for that reason, you had to behave in certain ways, which involved stifling your emotions. Maybe your parents were the kind of people who themselves lacked empathy or didn't have the emotional skills themselves to really be able to respond. Maybe they weren't very emotionally mature. Maybe they were well-meaning, but they had been emotionally neglected themselves. I mean, not forgetting, right, that my parents were brought up by parents who just lived through a war, right? And that affects people emotionally, and meant that what my grandparents were able to offer emotionally to their children was potentially, limited, because they had to adopt fighting, coping strategies to get through themselves. Maybe your parents were perfectionistic and have very high standards for you and couldn't tolerate the mess of upset and difficult emotions. Or maybe your parents were super achievement focused. So those are just some examples. And when I outline all of that, don't you think that actually applies to so many of us? We're actually a generation, a whole population of kind of people who have yet to gather emotional skills, people who've arrived at adulthood without emotional skills. And I've been lucky to be parenting at a time when there were some really juicy books out there that have helped me to understand, though I have to acknowledge and name and affirm my children's feelings. I didn't realize. Right? I didn't realize. You sort of, before you're a parent, you think love does everything, like some magic sauce. And it kind of does, but also some skills really help. Okay, another reason why we don't feel our feelings, why we become emotionally avoidant, is that we're in a society that's super focused on productivity and professionalism. And let's not forget that this is a man's world, right? Before the Second World War, women weren't in the workplace, they were in the home. And then they started going and doing all these jobs in munitions factory, like my granny was a welder, right? And afterwards, they don't want to go back to housework. They wanted a role, they wanted a job, and they wanted to be in the workplace. But workplace was a man's world. And I know I talk about the series Mad Men a lot, but honestly, it's such a fantastic depiction of women trying to find their way in a male workplace. Recommend it, even though there's about 8 series of it, and it will take about a month of your life if you watch it back to back. Patriarchy, the fact that it's a man's world, gives messages to both men and women about feelings. Men are told to be strong and don't feel, and women basically get the message that they're weak, hysterical, irrational drama queens, and that they're unpredictable, unreliable, and for that reason, they're a weak link to have in the workplace. Obviously, things are changing now. We talk a lot more about emotional intelligence in the workplace, and we're much more appreciative of how emotions play a part in the way that we relate, the way we create, and that we couldn't really function without them. But we have grown up in a society that was all about efficiency and productivity, and basically saw logic as being the only thing that mattered, and emotions as just being a messy interference with that. The third thing, and this is not to be underestimated, is self-judgment. We attach our own judgment to certain feelings, and we don't want to be having them. So we reject ourselves and we reject the having of them. We have a thought that if I feel something, I'm bad. For example, think about jealousy. Who wants to feel jealous? Who wants to own being a human who feels jealous? And yet we've all felt it. It's one of the human emotions. Okay, it's just part of the human experience. And it's there to show us that we desire something that we're seeing somebody else enjoy. It's there to show us that actually having that thing could be possible. It's there to, and yet, if I feel jealous, I'm bad is a very common feeling. We think it's a really ugly emotion, so we feel shame about it. So when we feel shame about having the feeling, obviously that process that we've been through where we notice that feeling and we open to it and we witness it becomes really difficult, because there's a part of us saying, you shouldn't be feeling that. I don't want to be the kind of person that feels that. I don't want to feel it. I shouldn't be feeling it. It's not the right thing to feel. If I feel that, that means I'm this kind of person, that kind of person. And this is how we end up avoiding our own feelings and not welcoming them, even though they are perhaps not the visitor that we wanted to have to stay. Okay, so I hope that's answered a few questions about that. Before we go, we're going to talk about urges. Stay with me.